I'll say as a Muslim woman myself, I never really wanted to write about Muslim women. It was like a little bit too close to home. Um, and, I came at this with an interest in French colonialism. I was interested in French colonialism from having studied abroad as an undergraduate and feeling like, I was always interested in histories that felt very alive. And spending time in France, the colonial history is like still so such a factor in the French present every day. And that felt like this is a history really worth studying for interrogating precisely those kinds of questions I was just mentioning about power. Um, And so I came to the project with an interest in French colonialism, with an interest in intellectual history, with an interest in gender, but like not really clear what the contours of the project were going to be. Initially, I was envisioning maybe a comparative thing that was looking at intellectual life in Algeria, Senegal, and Vietnam, maybe. And I started by just requesting some Algerian newspapers that I could get via interlibrary loan. Um, that I could get in Baltimore, where I was a graduate student at Johns Hopkins. And I got this newspaper and I started reading it. At that time, I didn't really have Arabic language skills. I only had the French. So that was also kind of partly why I started with Algeria. I thought like, well, 100 years in, I'll be able to find sources written by Muslims in French. So I start reading these French language publications and immediately, these discussions about women pop out to me, people describing the Prophet Muhammad as the first Arab feminist. And I'm like, what? And I turn to the kind of secondary literature to help me make sense. Like, can someone explain what I'm seeing? Like, why? Like, how fringe was this? I had so many questions. And no one was really mentioning these discussions at all. And so, it was like a thread that I just kept pulling at that yielded other discussions that merited further investigation. And obviously I never made it to Senegal or Vietnam. Yeah, so I was already focused on the interwar period before I started my doctoral work. I did a master's about Black feminists in Paris, like Paulette and Jane Nardal and other women from the Caribbean. And so I was already interested in the period. And I must say, I kind of buy the argument of historians like Mark Matera. I've written his book, The Global 30s, with Susan Kent. And others who argue like that there's this really important turning point in the interwar years, partially because of access to global news in Algeria. That's a real impetus for a lot of these discussions. Is changes in technology that Arthur Asraf and others have kind of charted. That make possible this new international orientation. And that's super interesting to me, is like what happens when you're looking abroad, reading news from other places, reflecting on your own society and having this kind of comparative perspective. And obviously the experience of World War I, traveling, coming back home, massive labor migration out of Algeria, those kinds of movements also obviously impact things and add to that kind of global frame that comes up. So I think, I've always kind of perceived it as this turning point. Initially, it was interesting to me because it felt like the beginnings of these discussions that would later blossom into, anti-colonial nationalism. I was very interested in like the Negritude movement in Paris at that time. But that was also part of the shift that led to this project, was a feeling that I was really tired of intellectual histories focused on Paris, London, New York. And I was kind of like, well, what's the intellectual life in colonial spaces? Because I felt the implication was almost that they were dead spaces, because we people had to come to Paris in order to be able to meet one another and engage in this rich intellectual discourse. I felt like that was the kind of implicit claim that was coming up in a lot of this intellectual history. So that was why from the beginning I was like, no, I want to start in Algiers, Oran, Constantine, what do these discussions look like there? So it was really important to me to learn Arabic and and include Arabic language source material. And When I did, I found that it drastically changed my understanding of the interwar moment in Algeria. In part because we as scholars have been so interested in the colonial relationship between Algeria and France for good reason. It's a very fruitful area of inquiry. But I saw when I looked at the Arabic language material that has really obfuscated Algeria's connections to the Middle East, which, when I talk to other historians of the Middle East, they're like, obviously they would be reading news from the Middle East and, thinking about that, there's this kind of like Muslim world framing that they adopt. But it wasn't obvious at all. And I think it's a kind of new direction, I would argue, in Algerian history to be thinking about those connections to the Middle East. And so, yeah, in terms of the source bases of the project broadly, the press is a really, really important one. I argue that it kind of illuminates a lot of discussions that would have been hard to find or impossible to find really in state archives. And then, of course, there is material from state archives that is kind of peppered throughout, surveillance reports, attempts by the French colonial state to kind of understand Algerian women's labor, for example, and measure like the numbers of women working and those kinds of questions. Discussions, obviously, about women's education that happened within the state. But then there's also like a lot of random sources that, you find along the way. Like I happened to be in Algeria waiting for authorization to come through to go into the state archives. And a friend was there and said, have you been to the archives of the Archdiocese of Algiers? And I'm like, no, what's that? And it's like this dusty basement. Dusty basement with like just piles of paper, no organization. And I ended up finding some master's theses there that are super interesting, like, written by French like girls, really women, who were doing degrees at the University of Algiers, who went and like interviewed, tons of Algerian women to try and get at, certain questions. And that was like a, totally surprising new source base. So, kind of unexpected things too ended up being particularly fruitful. But I would say overall, the real primary source base is the press. And I argue that the press in Algeria is different than the press in other places, right? Because it would be an oversimplification to say that it was just a mouthpiece for the elite, because you have lots of different types of people writing in it and writing into it. And also because of the orality of the press, the way that newspapers were read aloud in cafes, the kind of culture of the press extends beyond those who were literate. And so, and again, those who were elites. So I think it's fair to say that the press is kind of one piece within this larger ecosystem of public life that includes, cafe culture and, mosque culture and, association life and clubs and all of these different kinds of things. And it gives us access to a lot of those different worlds. Yeah, it's a hard one. I mean, in French, anybody who's coming from French history background knows like these debates about what to call settlers or what to call Algerian Muslims in this period. It's like so contentious. And so it's kind of incumbent upon all of us to make those choices and to kind of explain the choices we're making. So some of that feels like just, like, okay, guys, this is what I'm doing, very like par for being in this field, really, where these debates are so remain so contentious. But I think like the choice, for example, to use the terminology feminist and feminism is, I think was a little bit of a creative choice in a way. And I think one that, to me, I'll just pause and like, yeah, I'll just zoom out a little bit and say, for me, part of what was so interesting about these discussions about women that are happening in the press in this moment, is that they're writing back against what Judith Circus and others have argued is really the kind of ideological underpinnings of the whole imperial project. When they're saying that, no, Islam is not misogynist, and actually Islam has feminist possibility that expands beyond what European women have. For example, the right to enter into contracts independently, the right to own property, the right to manage and own their own finances, the right to keep their finances separate from their spouse, the right to enter, contracts, divorce, all of these things. When Algerian commentators are bringing this up and writing back against those French colonial claims, there's really something very interesting happening in the ways that they're kind of reordering colonial rhetoric. They're not just responding to it and saying it's inaccurate. They're saying, like, actually, you have no right to tell us that we're misogynist when Turkish women can vote and French women can't even vote. And the way that they're citing both new readings of Islamic history and Islamic knowledge, as well as news coming out of the Middle East. They're using like both the past and the present and this whole corpus of Islamic knowledge to say that this whole claim that we can't be modern subjects because of Islam and because of how inherently misogynistic Islam is bogus. And I just like could never get over this rhetorical move. I was just like, this is so powerful and interesting, and remains interesting in a moment in which stories about how misogynistic Muslims are continue to permeate our public discourse, and continue to be used to legitimize violence and exclusion. This was such a good story to me that I felt I had to bring it front and center with bold language, like the future is feminist, by labeling it as feminist discourse and saying, look, these people might not be what we would traditionally think of as feminists, and yet there is enormous feminist possibility in what they're arguing, and we should take that seriously because of the ways that it writes back against all of these assumptions that we continue to have, frankly. Yeah, it was a kind of organic division, I think, of the material based on themes, really. Um, so, the chapter on hijab and veiling is the perfect example. Like, I never in a million years wanted to write about the veil. I was like, enough, we've done it, we've said it all. Let's close the chapter, let's close the books. It's done, we're done here. And then in my sources, I kept seeing discussions about men's hats. And it was like, men's hats were so contentious, do they wear a tarbouch, a fez? Do they wear an amama? Do they wear a European style hat? Like, which is it? Are you, how dare you disrespect our culture and our people by wearing a European hat? Like, who do you think you are? And then like, oh, you're so old fashioned, you're wearing the tarbouch, like, God, and I was like, I've got to say something about this, because this is like way crazier debate than people would imagine. Like, who cares about hats? And I felt like hats and a comparison between men's hats and the discussions about veiling would be a way to kind of bring forward the way that many pieces of clothing become dense with political meaning at various moments throughout history, with various meanings, not just political meaning, religious meaning, cultural meaning, various social meanings. And so I thought that would be a fruitful discussion, because it would begin to undo some of the particularity that we always ascribe to veiling, as like veiling is this thing. It's only makes sense in Muslim contexts. It's so aberrational. It's so unusual, all of that. I thought it could help us see, like, no, actually in other moments, other forms of political clothing or of clothing have these intense implications and provoke all of this debate. So the sources really guided, what I chose to focus on. The same with, the chapter on education, for example, or the chapter on women's labor. It really wasn't that I had some kind of checkbox of places I wanted to go. It was simply that, you have this wealth of material and you're like, okay, well, these things kind of go together and these things kind of go together. I think things are always about, where there's exclusion, it's also about other things. So I used to have this argument with people in graduate school where I would say, like, it's really weird that you're not talking about race at all. And they would say, well, like the people I'm studying are like white people. And I'm like, yeah, that's also about race. And so, it's kind of that thing too, like, okay, you don't want to talk about women, that's fine, but like, that's also about gender, And so, yeah, there's certainly this feeling that like, there's very much a part of this story that's untold. And yeah, it requires us to kind of rethink some of our fetishization of state archives, as the sites where real history takes place, And I think thankfully we're firmly in that moment as scholars now, I think, where we can take seriously other kinds of source material. This is one of the things I was really excited about this book for, because I kind of have one foot in French colonial history and one foot in Middle Eastern history. And there have been these really classic texts of Middle Eastern women's history over the last, 20, 30 years. And there was no such text really for Algeria. And so, in some ways, when I would explain this work to, other scholars of the Middle East, they were kind of like, oh, so this is like, what Beth Barron did for Egypt, but you're doing it for Algeria, or what, Elizabeth Thompson did for Syria, but you're doing it for Algeria. The class dynamics are really one of the things that really sets Algeria apart from these other Middle Eastern spaces, because in Egypt, in Syria, and Palestine, it's these kind of elite women who are leading, feminist movements. And in Algeria, there's just settler colonialism has squeezed the economy so much that there's barely any middle class, let alone like a class of educated elite women who, have the time to like put, to organize a feminist movement. And so, again, that those dynamics could lead us to say, yeah, there's no such thing in Algeria. There's no comparable thing in Algeria. But I think when we take these women's mobility seriously, and what a dramatic shift these domestic workers' mobility provoked in the city space, and the kind of anxiety that it provoked in the press. And when we take all of that seriously, we see, no, it was impactful. And again, it was really impactful when we know about later generations, and how later generations of mujahidat had mothers who were domestic workers. And so when we look at like, what are the kinds of things that domestic work enabled in terms of mobility, in terms of visibility, in terms of earning power, all of those things have dramatic effects within the family, within a society writ large. And at the same time in the book, I'm kind of careful too, right? Because I think like in 2024, we really want a story that's like working girls, they're going out there, they're making their money, they're buying lipstick, they're having fun. And some of that is true. I mean, I talk about one domestic worker who also, acted on stage as a theater performer, like, so in some ways there are those exciting stories. But in other ways, it's like, yeah, these women were earning very little money. We should be careful not to kind of romanticize what was possible because of their new work. I mean, the male unemployment was like rampant in this moment, and so it's like, this is money that is survival wages barely, and so. Again, I try to kind of embrace both sides of it, that in some ways this is big public opening, and in other ways it's still quite constrained. That's a huge context to understanding what these discussions about women. So Muslim reform or Islamic modernism emerges in Egypt in the late 19th century, and is kind of brought into Algeria by Abdelhamid Ben Badis. And Ben Badis, from the very beginning of his kind of project of spreading this new kind of understanding of Islam, he was very adamant that women needed to be educated. He would hold classes for women in his own Green Mosque in Constantine, where like reportedly the lights were turned down low so women could unveil if they wanted. This was like very controversial. And so this movement is part of this kind of impetus for discussing women, the status of women, how women had a much more public role and elevated status in early Islamic history, according to these thinkers, and how that's been kind of erased over time, or how Algeria has kind of deviated from that. And so that's a really important context to kind of understanding this. And those scholars were all insisting that, Muslims have the right to kind of read the Quran for themselves. They should develop their own personal relationship with the Quran and Islamic knowledge broadly. And so I think that kind of empowered lay thinkers to begin to kind of cite various pieces of the kind of corpus of Islamic knowledge. Like it's kind of like, if people have ever read fatwas, this is how fatwas are, right? Islamic scholars will arrange various pieces of Islamic knowledge to make an argument that XYZ thing is permissible, not permissible. And in this moment, you have, every everyday ordinary school teachers, for example, saying like, well, this part of the Quran says blah, blah, blah. And actually, we know that the Prophet Muhammad did da, da, da. So why shouldn't women, blah, blah, blah. And so this kind of interesting intellectual move that's important. And I think allowed people to engage in that kind of work in new ways. I mean, that becomes quite fruitful for these discussions, because, they're able to bring in Islamic knowledge, which I think spoke to a lot of Algerians who, have this concern that the French, that there's this, again, they're hearing all of this discourse from the French that Islam is misogyny, and that, Muslims are secondary, of secondary cultural status, civilizational status because of Islam. And so to have these really these ideas that no, Islam has this kind of majestic history, both in terms of women and in terms of civilization, and we can kind of resurrect it. Those are messages that really resonate 100 years into a colonial project in which most people are impoverished and really struggling. That's a huge, it's a huge determining factor for a lot of this. And that's also my answer to the historians of the Middle East, by the way, who would say, why is this different from Egypt or Syria, or Turkey or Palestine, or Iran? I say, well, the settler colonial context is a big determinant for how this comes up. So one thing is, when I talk about these kinds of claims from the French colonial state that Algerians are inferior because of their religion, it's worth understanding that because of the presence of settler colonialism, those are everyday, Algerians are encountering those ideas regularly, whether it's in schooling, whether it's in, the difficulty in accessing medical care, whether it's in, in all of these different arenas. Algerians are continually confronted with their secondary status. And so that builds a kind of new impetus to write back against it, right? So there's this idea that Algerians are in danger of kind of losing their culture, losing their religion, feeling shame. There's all of this discussion about emotions and the kind of emotional experience that settler colonialism produces, and particularly this shame about one's identity, and this lack of dignity that one experiences when there's this constant denial of one's humanity. So I think that the discourse is very much responding to that. And then there's also, there's just this disparity that's very, very visible. So for example, I think in 1936, 3% of Algerian girls who were of school age were in French colonial schools, as compared to almost 70% of settler European girls. So there's just also this very stark disparity on the ground between what's possible in areas like education, for example, as well as, of course, labor, other areas. But so I think like those visible displays of how different things are also provoke this kind of internal gaze within Algerian society, trying to kind of, understand and again, critique. I'll say that I think those tensions are most richly explored in the final chapter of the book, which turns to the late 1940s, because there is one particular publication that has a women's page that emerges in that moment. And so you have dozens of women writing in. And so that's where you really see a lot of the disparity between different visions of women's advancement. And you see women critiquing the kind of older discourses that appear throughout the book too. So you have women saying, there's all of this discussion about how women should be educated, but when we try to walk to school, we face so much harassment from men in the street. Or there's all of this rhetoric about women as like the, important, the kind of center of the household and their value within the household. And yet we have no decision-making power and we're constantly disrespected by our husbands, for example. And there you really see also a critique of this kind of assimilation, like exactly what you're describing. So like, how dare men come and talk about us unveiling when they're wearing a suit, they're wearing a tie, they barely speak Arabic. There's this whole thing about like, we still speak our mother tongue, or definitely more of these kind of fears articulated about, will assimilation to Frenchness or even the participation in French public discourse, kind of corrupt us or lead to us losing our faith. And there's one woman who appears throughout the book, Jamila Dabesh. She was a journalist in the interwar years. And in the late 40s, she starts her own publication, L'Action, that's kind of aimed at women talking about gender issues. And she is someone who really straddles both worlds. So she grows up, she has her teenage years in France, actually, and then comes back to Algeria. And when she's in Algeria, she's like critiqued by others for like, oh, she drinks wine, she only speaks French, she barely speaks Arabic. She's critiqued for being too assimilated. But actually in the Interwar years, her articles appear. She writes an article that gets published in a Muslim reformist newspaper. And so it's interesting that that's part of the thing I write about, is this intellectual fluidity in which people who really disagreed with each other in a lot of ways, a publication would still publish their views. They still have this, are able to kind of meet in the middle and coalition build around particular issues. But she writes a book in the 40s. And this book is it's a kind of novel that you can tell is kind of autobiographical in a way. And she's writing about how challenging it is to be among this kind of Algerian elite, because you're perceived by your own society as being too assimilated to French culture, as being an outsider. And yet, you're still looked upon with this kind of disdain from dominant French culture and presumed to be stupid, presumed to be, uncultured, all of these things. So she writes about how hard it is. And the character of the book falls in love with this kind of elite Algerian man who's also educated, also very well-versed and fluent in kind of French culture in Algiers. And his brother ends up ultimately saying, I don't think she'll be a good wife for you. I don't think it's going to work out because, she's too assimilated. And Jamila Dabesh notes, like, he wasn't even wearing a fez. He wasn't even wearing a tarbouche. He was wearing a suit. Like, how dare he tell me I'm too assimilated, And so it's kind of like this pain of being, one of these few people who did kind of straddle both worlds and feels no sense of acceptance or belonging from either world. So there are kind of bits of that throughout the book. Um, the question of the war is a big one, and you can tell by reading even just the introduction of the book, I'm really reacting in a way against the teleology of the war and this, obsession with the war in our field. And again, for good reason, right? It's a good story, and scholars who work on that period continue to uncover new interesting aspects we haven't thought about before. So we're not done by any means with that history. And yet I think it can obfuscate other interesting things that are going on. And so when I wanted to focus on women in this period, I really decided that I wasn't going to let the dominant interest in anti-colonial nationalism and, this neat line to the war. I wasn't going to let that dictate how the book went or what the book focused on. But that said, I think the book helps us make sense of what came before. So I think, the kind of view of Algerian society that Fanon, for example, maps in Algeria Unveiled, in which Algeria is very much kind of trapped in this patriarchal society, and then in the war, and there's all this pressure from the French, and then in the war, women, take this big leap forward into public life through their participation in the war. I'm not interested in getting into like Fanon was right, Fanon was wrong. That's not why I bring that up. But I do think that perspective has very much colored our understanding of Algerian women in history. And particularly it's just an inevitability when there's so much silence in the scholarship and then this focus on them in the war. It's almost like there's this implicit assumption they were like locked in the harem and then one day busted down the door and we're like, we're ready to fight, ready to fight in the Algerian war. Of independence. And so I was like, there seems like a chapter that's missing in this story. And so, some mujahidat, women who participated in the war, one described her mother as illiterate but hyper politicized. And so I kind of saw myself as telling a story of the generation that came before, and the ways that they were extremely constrained by a variety of factors. And yet they were, moving into public life in new ways, taking on new social roles, accessing an education where and when they could, even when that was quite limited, and kind of making use of those things to support their family, to uplift their family, to contribute to society. So that's my answer about the war. In terms of today, I'm always kind of grappling with these questions, really, about like what the work we're studying and what the work we're doing can tell us about the current moment that we're in. Because to me, it needs to, right? I mean, I'm not interested in just investigating the past and then considering that done. I think we have to understand connections to the present. And as I mentioned, that was one thing that drew me to French history and French colonial history in the very beginning. So I think after October, the discourses in the kind of global public discourses, I felt like were again surprisingly reminiscent of things that I have studied and encountered and researched. So ideas about Muslim men being particularly capable of monstrous violence and of sexual violence. Yeah, I mean, that's the big one. So I wrote an article from the Middle East Eye about that particular trope and saying, this is not to suggest that sexual violence didn't happen on October 7th. But what I'm interested in is why at the very beginning, when there was no evidence yet available, the public so readily accepted and believed that happened. And to me, the reason the public could accept that and believe that is because we're already primed to have certain ideas about Muslim men and what they're capable of. I mean, similar ideas, like similarly with the story of 40 beheaded babies. It's like, why did we believe that? And why did that belief so readily get metabolized into an acceptance of very outsized violence? And so I think, it's obviously hard. I work on French colonial Algeria. It's not a context to kind of, I have reservations, obviously, about scholars kind of who aren't experts in this area inserting themselves. And on the other hand, when the comparisons are so obvious and when for those of us who work on these questions, we feel like, what, this is actually really old. These are really old ideas that are in circulation again. I do feel like there's a kind of public responsibility to say, like, look, we have expertise. We know that these ideas can legitimize enormous violence and exclusion. And there's ways to talk about sexual violence. There's ways to take all of these concerns seriously in ways that are not reproducing Islamophobic tropes. And so, yeah, I did feel the need to kind of wade in there. On that question. And I think, just more broadly in terms of French politics, like I said, these questions continue to animate discussions. To what extent does Muslim misogyny render Muslims, ineligible for modern citizenship or modern participation in modern life? I mean, it's like we've got to grapple with how old these ideas are and how politically convenient they've been at various moments in order to be able to kind of dismantle them in the present. Books like mine also try to give us some hope from the past, right? Some sense that like there were feminist discourses, even in moments that we might think of as like, where women were so constrained for a variety of reasons. And so, I talk in the book about the idea of feminist possibility. And I think that's really important because sometimes when we use the word feminism, we expect, like, we have a very particular vision in our mind of what it looks like women organizing together, very particular kind of themes. But when we think about feminist possibility, it can be just the smallest kind of seeds that later get planted into something big. And I think that's kind of an optimistic framing. So I hope it offers us some hope. So I have an article that's coming out soon with French colonial history or French historical studies, sorry, that is looking at the workshops, or I guess schools. The French call them schools, but really they only teach artisanal training. That I kind of mention in the book, but there just wasn't enough space to go into. And so I have an article that's focusing particularly on those French colonial workshops that the state sets up for women, and how there's really interesting dynamics at play. In one hand, because the French are trying to take this labor that previously women were completing in the home. Previously, it would be like a mother or an aunt or a grandmother would teach a girl weaving and say, like, let's weave the materials that will be part of your bridal trousseau, like a bedspread and, different things you can use around the house. And the French state is kind of taking this labor and trying to move it into the space of a workshop and put at the head a French teacher. And the idea is to kind of teach women how to be waged workers. And the state will then benefit from. So I argue it's kind of like a racial capitalist lens, but like bringing Algerian women into that. And it's really interesting too what the French do, like in terms of they want to create a market for Algerian carpets. And so they want it to be differentiated. Like Algiers has its own style, Constantine has its own style. And they're like inventing actual styles that go like, okay, we're going to mix like Persian and Indian motifs, and that's going to be the Constantine style. We're going to mix like Moorish, Spanish, techniques of weaving, and that's going to be the style from Oran, for example. Like that, they're like it's like very interesting, weird things that are going on with these workshops. That are super interesting. And then of course they're branding it as like authentic Algerian goods. So that didn't make it into the book. And that'll be an article. But otherwise I'm kind of moving away from Algeria. So the next book project is a history of the Middle East from the perspective of teenage girls. And it's looking at Iraq. I've done some oral histories with women who were teenagers in the 60s and 70s in Baghdad. But again, I have ambitions for a comparative thing, but it didn't work out so much with Algeria. So if this becomes just a book of Iraqi history, so be it. But we'll see. We'll see. It remains to be seen.